Who's Martha?
Who? Oh, Martha. The only thing left of my movie career. She's about 50. She's married. Her son goes to UCLA. She comes to me twice a week, beats me black and blue, for which I...
Have you thought about it a second time?
I'm interested.
When did you decide?
Yesterday, about 3 p.m.
Well, I see. Just didn't get around to announcing the official results.
I wanted you to think about it twice, too.
And then a kiss. And that distinctive voice, of course, is Humphrey Bogart, one of the great stars of classic Hollywood, an archetype, an icon onto himself. Humphrey Bogart, a subject of our podcast today, our first podcast of the spring 2020 season. This is Dr. J, the movie Imaginarium. I'm here with Dr. Dan. We've been working on, over the past several podcasts, we've been working on sort of defining and excavating some of the political and cultural and social themes of leading men of Hollywood and of the kind of masculine anxieties that Hollywood seems to be so well invested in. And we're trying to sort of analyze and, as I mentioned, excavate some of these deeper meanings and getting at the heart of what Hollywood's cultural contribution is to American culture. And Dr. Dan and I have decided that Humphrey Bogart would be an important figure to look at a little bit more in depth because of his importance to classic Hollywood, that distinctive voice, that distinctive face, and his way of walking. There's something, I think, indelible and unforgettable about Humphrey Bogart, and he's worth revisiting. Hello, Dr. Dan. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. I'm doing well. So what are your thoughts about Humphrey Bogart? Where do you want to begin here?
Well, I think, just kind of rehearsing this and going through a couple of documentaries, and Stephen Bogart, his son, with Lauren Bacall, he said something really interesting, basically paraphrasing. Humphrey was difficult to get close to, and then he said he's a loner, and then sort of towards the end of that sentence, he says he was kind of a lonely man, and so it very much resonated with these themes that we've been going through, and it's
the lonely man in American movies.
Yeah, and it's nice to kind of start at the beginning because in many ways he is the anti-hero archetype, and as I was putting these notes together, it does seem to the anti-hero is lonely when we think of Han Solo, Clint Eastwood, right? Dirty Harry, those types. They are lonely people that can't really be around others, which perhaps that makes them the anti-hero versus, I always think, the cheesy old school hero who is super nice and helps kids with their ice cream or something. The anti-hero would never do that, right? Because they're bleak and they're depressed.
Yeah.
Right.
And caustic and abrasive as well.
Yes.
They're lonely in some ways because the anti-hero always has a strong component of being antisocial.
Yeah.
And misanthropic.
Yeah. They have an impatience with feigning, right? With the sort of the false gestures, and so there's a level of impatience.
Yes. Yeah, and I think Humphrey Bogart not only signifies this in his characters and in his acting, but he himself was this and becomes this more and more in classic Hollywood. Humphrey Bogart was born on the last Christmas of the 19th century, on December 25th, 1899. A lot of contemporary observers in the 40s and 50s, as Bogey's career really takes off, thought that this was just a publicity stunt, that his birthday was something else. But in fact, his real birthday was the last Christmas of the 19th century. He was born to Dr. Belmont DeForest Bogart, who was a prosperous physician in New York. Dr. Belmont DeForest Bogart expected much out of his son. His mother was Maud, and she was a suffragette and a magazine illustrator who prided herself in having studied in Paris and was an independent and intellectual woman. So Humphrey Bogart was raised in a rather privileged, well-to-do, intellectual family in New York City. That wasn't the life that Bogey ultimately led. And it's an interesting trajectory. Of course, he went to some of the finest schools, started at Trinity in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and ended up at Andover, a prestigious and elite school that was supposed to prepare him for a life at Yale and a life of upper middle class respectability, of course. But he flunked 5 out of 7 subjects. He flunked the Bible, he flunked French, he flunked English, he flunked chemistry and geometry. The headmaster wrote sternly to Dr. Bogart that young Bogey was forced to, that the headmaster was forced to advise you that young Bogey, it becomes required and necessary for us to seek his withdrawal from the school. And so Bogey was sent adrift, fortuitously, perhaps. It was the year was 1918, and Bogart in 1918 decided to join the Navy. Found himself on a ship transport boat, and came back to America without much to do. A veteran in his short time in World War I. He ends up in New York. He becomes an excellent chess player. He's very well learned and very well read. These, I think, are some of the things that we don't often associate with the Bogey character that we've come to know through classic Hollywood. In fact, Bogey was very well-to-do, well-read. Apparently, he played chess so well, he was almost at the master level of chess. But he wasn't destined for Yale. And he also wasn't destined for Broadway, but that's where he ultimately ends up at first. He ends up in Broadway. He ends up playing a lot of straight characters. He was often associated as being a sort of young and attractive, good-looking, ham-like character on stage in Broadway. Again, not what we expect from looking back in time, looking at who we know to be Bogey in classic Hollywood. His big break, of course, came with the theatrical production of The Petrified Forest on stage, and Leslie Howard as the star. Leslie Howard, one of the great English actors of the time. Humphrey Bogart played the killer Duke Mantee in The Petrified Forest on Broadway and got some really good reviews for that performance. Warner Brothers, the film studio in Hollywood, optioned and bought the rights to The Petrified Forest and sought to put together a cast. They wanted Leslie Howard bad. Leslie Howard was a major star at the time and was very attractive for a lot of leading roles in Hollywood. Leslie Howard had a very distant relationship with Hollywood. He didn't like Hollywood very much at all. He was one of these sort of New Yorkers felt this way as well, but especially English actors or those from Europe and those from New York often felt like Hollywood in Southern California was devoid of culture, devoid of art, devoid of seriousness and intellectuality, and was just a sort of empty surface level shell of entertainment. And Leslie Howard certainly felt that way. It was very difficult to get him to sign on to roles in Hollywood, even though he was very much in demand. He preferred the English countryside or the stage in London and in New York. At any rate, Warner Brothers offered him a fairly substantial amount of money to recreate his lead role protagonist in The Petrified Forest. He agreed. Warner Brothers sought out what they thought would be the perfect fit for Duke Mantee, the killer in The Petrified Forest, and that's Edward G. Robinson. And we both agree, Dr. Dan and I, that Edward G. Robinson would have been probably fantastic in that role. Edward G. Robinson is a great character actor of the 1930s and 40s and was a gangster in Little Caesar and was in a lot of really excellent noir pictures. Any thoughts about Edward G. Robinson and his career and some of the movies that you've seen him in?
Yeah, I mean, between him and Bogart and what's his name, Cagney, like their voices are that time. Mm-hmm. Like that's the tough voice, which is that New York. Yeah. The stereotypical gangster voice.
Yeah. Yeah, my favorite role of Edward G. Robinson, of course, is as Keyes in Double Indemnity, the lead insurance investigator, right? Yeah. Who has a little man inside him, and smokes a lot of cigars and talks very fast, and it's just a terrific role in what I think is the greatest noir movie ever made with Barbara Stanwyck and Fred MacMurray. So at any rate, Warner Brothers wanted Edward G. Robinson to play the role, but Leslie Howard refused. Bogart was actually the one who sent the telegram to Leslie Howard as he was enjoying his English estate with the news that Warner Brothers had chosen Edward G. Robinson over the young and unproven Humphrey Bogart. And it was Leslie Howard who telegrammed Warner Brothers directly and said, if there's no Bogey, there's no Leslie Howard. That was the telegram. And Warner Brothers knew that in order to keep their very attractive English male protagonist, they had to agree to sign Humphrey Bogart to the role of Duke Mantee, the killer. Let's talk a little bit about The Petrified Forest as a film. I think this film works so good, and I think there's so much complexity to this film, even though in many ways it's just a straight adaptation of the Broadway play. There's not much different from the original screenplay of the theatrical production. But the performances are absolutely stellar. You have Bette Davis in the role of a young woman in the middle of absolutely nowhere, right? On the edge of the petrified forest. And I think the symbolism of what a petrified forest means, I think, is really interesting to the meaning of this film. But here we have a young, idealistic and romantic, headstrong, desperately desirous for a cosmopolitan life, a beautiful young Bette Davis who is trapped in a diner in the absolute middle of nowhere, pining for civilization and some connection to the outer world, right? And here comes along a dashing Englishman named Leslie Howard, or the actor Leslie Howard.
Alan Squire.
Alan Squire is the name of the character, who happens upon this diner in the middle of nowhere, and absolute sparks and connections. Not just in the story, I think with the two actors. I think Leslie Howard and Bette Davis were phenomenally good in this role. And for any viewer, even us watching it, 80 years into the future, you can see the energy that exists between them a little bit. Did you get that feel as well in those opening sequences when Leslie Howard comes into the diner?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he's sort of kind of playing it down, but yeah. Bette Davis was a lot different in this than I expected.
How so?
I don't think I really have seen too many Bette Davis movies, but Bette Davis, I feel like the blurry version of Bette Davis I know is a few years later, where I see this tough,
assertive,
kind
loud,
of
brash,
like she would cut your throat.
Yeah.
Bette Davis. I don't even know if that's accurate or not, but that was the guy. And then you see her in this, and it's like, oh wow, like it's just a different dimension, but it is Bette Davis.
Yeah. No, I certainly agree. I mean, by the time of the 1940s, Bette Davis and her film roles become very in control and in charge and brash and loud.
Yeah.
Even in films like Dark Victory, where she goes blind and is a melodrama of which, her, the trials and travails of her experience and the character of that film really kind of test her a great deal and quiet and give her a lot of humility. There's always in a Bette Davis film this sort of shining light of who Bette Davis is that always comes out very, very strongly. She was known as an actor who often would dominate against male leads early on in her career, and nobody could take their eyes off her. Of course, one of her early big hits of Human Bondage, a film about drug addiction and abuse, has her at her most dramatic and has her at her most skilled in terms of her acting chops. And you've got those later pictures in the 1940s and even in the 1950s where she's a top-billed star. There's something qualitatively different, I think, about how we know and approach the icon Bette Davis in those roles. That's different than her character in The Petrified Forest. Her character in The Petrified Forest is like some small-town innocent girl. And the innocence and romantic idealism that is so part and parcel of her character just seems to be wildly off the mark from some of Bette Davis's more stronger roles.
Yeah, or there's a pent-up energy that can anticipate because she just needs to get out. She needs to work through circles of intellectual, artistic, cosmopolitanism, and perhaps that's when you would see the Bette Davis that you get to know later. But I still you do see it in that role. It's just it's so different.
Yeah, certainly. that film Of Human Bondage that I mentioned, that was 1934. That was 2 years before The Petrified Forest, and that was also a Warner Brothers picture. That was really a critical breakthrough for Bette Davis. She played a vulgar waitress who ends up, riddled with a drug addiction, and the physical decline as well as the mental decline throughout that movie require just top-notch acting, and that's when people realized that Bette Davis was a different sort of actor in Hollywood, somebody who could take on the most challenging roles. Bette Davis, of course, was very, very difficult for the studio moguls. She was a very headstrong, independent actor, and she was unfortunately not responsible for the complete breakdown of this so-called like reserve clause or the contractual control that studios had over what were their property. These actors had very little choices. They were employees of these businesses, and they were given scripts and they were given movies, and you didn't have a lot of wiggle room to say no or to choose your own parts or to shape your own image through film. There was so much control for an actor, but Bette Davis fought that viciously in the 1930s and the 1940s. And although she didn't really break up the system, she was instrumental, at least in laying the foundation for what becomes the breakdown of this and more creative control from the actors. She was able to wrest herself from Warner Brothers and was able to make movies with other studios. But that came at a cost. And one of the consequences is that Bette Davis was labeled difficult in Hollywood. And to the degree that she was difficult on the set, there are stories, contemporary stories, that kind of shape both sides. From a lot of perspectives of the actors that worked with her, she was a consummate professional and would challenge you, but was somebody that a great many people found to be not only a joy to work with, but somebody that they learned from, somebody who took their craft incredibly seriously. Some of her other great performances are in Dark Victory, I mentioned, where she goes blind. That's from 1939. The Letter from 1940. The Little Foxes from 1941. And one of my all-time favorites, Now Voyager. And Now Voyager is a really interesting film with Paul Onread. Now Voyager she plays a Boston Brahmin, rich and privileged young woman who, in dress and makeup and hair and with the glasses, immediately portrays this incredibly frigid, timid, scared young woman who has never experienced the world and is absolutely dominated by her mother. And she has to break out of this shell. And she does so through like psychoanalysis, and Claude Rains becomes this doctor who kind of takes her under his wing and lets her flower and become herself. So Now Voyager is a movie about a woman sort of breaking out of the mold and the caste from which they are trapped, the cages of social expectations and tradition and familial expectations, and becoming a full-blown woman. She meets Paul Onread, who's married, but they nonetheless develop a love affair. And it's a complicated, really wonderful melodrama. I mention it because it's a movie that, in the first part of the movie, it cuts against the grain of what we know to be Bette Davis and what we knew to be Bette Davis at the time of 1942. But that just works to the advantage of the film because we're all, as spectators, waiting for Bette Davis to kind of break open and become the Bette Davis that we expect, which, of course, she ends up doing. And that terrific film, Now Voyager. Let's go back to The Petrified Forest a little bit. Yeah, what are your thoughts on the relationship between what's Bette Davis's character? Do you have that there?
Yeah, it's Gabrielle Maple.
That's right, Gabrielle. So what are your thoughts on the relationship between Gabrielle and the sort of knucklehead gas station employee guy playing football?
Was it Jackie?
Yeah, Jackie.
Joseph Sawyer. Yeah. I would say it's like the caricature of, he's the only guy in the area. He's strong, a little dumb, but well-meaning. It's almost like he's the archetype of the old hero. And then when you have Bogart come in, who, while he is playing a bad guy, it's funny that he's also, anticipating the anti-hero as well. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, it was just, and it's the compromise, right? It's the compromise that she's trying to escape because she knows he's the best thing that is available. And so,
yeah, he's the kind of person that she will be eventually forced to marry if she stays in this.
And again, it's funny to, it's fun to watch this stuff and thinking about masculinity and like from our eyes today, this guy is like a creep, so creepy. But then you'd have to expect, well, this is mainstream men's behavior.
Yeah, and one scene in particular,
36.
he basically sexually assaults her.
Yeah,
right?
and it's just like, wow, it's interesting how these Hollywood films, it's a different world.
Yeah.
It's just a completely very violent, misogynist world, which, I mean, it's, all these artifacts never change, but we change as spectators. And it almost makes her character even more radical.
Yeah, I think so.
And I guess we'll get to this, but the wife of the wealthy individual that comes in, where you're watching it from today's perspective, and you're like, oh my God, like this is a seed of second wave feminism.
Yeah.
Or it's the after effects of the suffrage movement. And it's just, it's interesting.
I like what you say about how the artifacts don't change, but time changes and our relationship to these artifacts change. And I think that there's always an opportunity for new things to be revealed. And I think that's a lot of what this podcast is about. We're looking back at older movies and revealing certain threads, especially pertaining to masculinity and patriarchy and misogyny that are apparent in these films and that are revealing to us now. Perhaps if they weren't so revealing in the time. But I think The Petrified Forest, and with this character of Jackie, I think that there's a lot to be revealed here. It's actually really fascinating in a lot of ways. Another element of this is that the audience is put into a position in which we are so easily intuitively reject the character of Jackie, not just because of his caustic abrasiveness, but there's this deeper thing going on, right? Which is that what attracts Leslie Howard's character, Alan, right? What attracts Alan to, what is so attractive about Alan to Gabrielle?
Yeah.
And that's this intellectualism and worldliness, right? As opposed to Jackie's gruff, athletic,
he's supposed to be manning the gas pump, and he's like rolling around in the sand with that football, and he's in uniform.
Yeah. But these are, I think this is strikingly interesting because it would be, imagine a contemporary Hollywood movie shaping a similar set of masculine identities.
Yeah.
I would find it very hard to believe that Hollywood would ever make a movie like that in a way.
It'd be like Airplane. It'd be that kind of completely absurdist.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it'd be almost surreal, right? We sort of expect our masculine heroes to be the athletic small-town Jackie. And, the English worldly actor in a contemporary Hollywood movie would definitely be the foil, if not the bad guy, the villain, right?
Yeah, he's there to, and again, I had no idea what the movie was about, so I'm watching it. And as he comes in, I'm like, oh, what's he going to do? Like, I didn't trust him from the get-go. So I was just like, oh, man, he's not going to get the girl that he's being horrible to. But yeah, it turns out.
So you've been trained by contemporary movies to be skeptical of Leslie Howard as he comes in.
He's too smart, right?
Yeah,
he's going to use his words to seduce.
Yeah, he's crafty and clever.
Yeah.
He's not down to earth and,
Yeah.
So I think that there's an interesting element of that in the film. Of course, they bond over a François Villon poem, and Gabrielle realizes just how cultivated, I think is the right word, that Alan, this Englishman, really is, and she absolutely falls for him right away. All of this is broken up, and it's broken up by a really interesting sort of element, I think. And if you take a step back from this story, and if you just kind of look at it in isolation, it's interesting that here's this diner and this budding romantic love affair, and all of these things are quite normal and everyday. Mm-hmm. And then what happens in this film is like this sort of exogenous force of violence, of evil,
Yeah.
and of randomness and contingency. Because part of what Duke Mantee, the famous killer, I think part of what makes it a compelling character is that you have no idea what to expect with this guy. He's completely unpredictable.
And you hear the radio broadcast, so you know something's coming.
Yeah, it's getting closer and closer, like a storm.
Yeah.
Right, like the darkened clouds, and so Duke enters the diner. He's a notorious gangster, fleeing police pursuit. And what was your make of the moment Humphrey Bogart enters this picture as Duke Mantee? What were your thoughts?
I mean, you just smile at first because you're like, yeah, it's the it's what you're waiting for, even though it's not billed as Humphrey Bogart. But I mean, for me, it was just like, now I'm really going to pay attention because this is the role that breaks his career. That this is the role that, okay, he can play a gangster, but we already know what he's like, right? Because we already know his history. So you're really looking for the nuances. Mm-hmm. And I think you do get the nuances in there, because how many times does he compromise and that mask of violence slips a bit?
Yeah.
Where there is a little bit of an anti-hero in him, but some of the notes I put, he's scared, but to deal with his fear, he uses violence.
Yeah.
Right. And so it kind of goes back to the David Lynch, Dennis Hopper's character, but
certainly,
and suppresses his fear with violence. And then I think what makes him what sets up him to personify the anti-hero is he understands all of this as his own choice, which I think that's powerful, because it's easier to make the gangster the personification of evil, and they're kind of, just out to create havoc. But for him, right, it's, if he was all about havoc, he wouldn't be waiting for that other group of people to show up. Mm-hmm. Right.
That's a good point.
And he takes care of his people.
Yeah.
Right. Remember, you go get something to eat. It's your shift.
Yeah.
That's different.
Yeah.
Right. That's a different sort of bad guy that you begin to connect to.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. So he's maniacal. He's somewhat irrational. The fear. I love how Bogey skillfully portrays this. So you can see the fear on his face at certain moments in the film. But he masks much of this fear with violence. All of those things being said, he's in control and he has choices that he can make. These are the kinds of characteristics that we so often assume a white male has, despite the fact they may be a villain of a Hollywood movie or an anti-hero. We have choices, right? Yeah. Choice, which comes down to sort of like core liberal values, right? The liberal man with choices to be made. And you definitely see that in this picture. You also have a number of other characters who come in, and we should introduce those as well. Mr. and Mrs. Chisholm, right? The wealthy tourists who come in and are effectively trapped in the diner with Duke Mantee and the gangsters. The wealthy Chisholms have their chauffeur with them, played by John Alexander. And say more about this. I think this brings in a lot of really interesting complexity. You pointed out before that especially Betty Davis's character in relationship to Mrs. Chisholm, that there is a dynamic here that reveals something liberatory, even feminist.
It's almost as if they forgot it's a movie, right? Because you're not supposed to say this. It was one of those, both of these instances are, you're not supposed to say this out loud, because suddenly the naturalness of it is now defined, and now it becomes not seen as natural, but now it's an arbitrary decision based on power.
Yeah.
Right. And so in the case of Mrs. Chisholm, right, she basically tells Gabrielle, get out of here. Don't get married. Don't do what I am caged now. My life is finished. I have to serve this guy. Get out of here. And there's sort of, she knows she's never going to get out. And she at least can know that if Gabrielle gets out, she can be relieved as she helps someone not fall for the same trap she did. Do you have the name of one of the gangsters, African American? It was one of Bogart's crew. I think there's 3 of them that come in, that along with Bogart. But
the name of the character in the film, I cannot remember.
yeah, it wasn't on my list.
Is it Commander? This was an uncredited role, I think.
Okay, so he's very, typical of Hollywood. But
Yeah.
but anyway, you have 2 African American men in this film. One is playing the chauffeur, which is the traditional role of black men, as a servant, right?
Oh, Slim. I think it's Slim.
Oh, Slim. That's
Yeah.
right. So Slim is the character's name.
Yes. And the actor is also named Slim Thompson.
Okay, Slim Thompson. So you have the one, the old school role of which comes out of the Sambo, servant of white men.
Mm-hmm.
He's the chauffeur, always asking like, "Hey, boss, what do I need to do?" Listening to direction, and then Slim comes in, and there is that element of he's the lowest on the totem pole within the gang.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also, and he makes him eat in the back with the cook, which
Yeah.
is Jim Crow.
Yeah.
Jim Crow procedure.
But he has more autonomy and more
But
freedom than
yes,
the chauffeur.
Yes. And so again, from our perspective versus 36, you'd see the perspective of perhaps, a predominantly white audience would sympathize with the black chauffeur, and you see how he's a good, a good black American,
Because he knows his place.
Yeah, knows his place. And then the criminal, his criminal counterpart,
Slim.
who is autonomous,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That now autonomy gets right. It gets pulled together with criminalization.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. And to
it's
me,
threatening and negative in
yeah.
1936.
It's literally like a definition of like anti-blackness in the sense of black autonomy equals criminality.
Yeah,
Black subservience equals freedom.
yeah, yeah.
Right, which is the foundation, right, of
Yeah.
the country in many ways. Naturalization Act of 1790,
Mm-hmm.
and so, and then they have that dialogue, right? What was the dialogue like? He's the Slim is telling the chauffeur, "You're listening to this guy. You're subservient. You're a disgrace."
Yeah, yeah.
And
You have no freedom whatsoever.
you have no freedom whatsoever.
Yeah.
And so, again, from a 1936 perspective, lynchings are still going on. The Nazis haven't ruined American white supremacy yet, right? It's still you pledge of allegiance to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so you watch that scene, and yes, Slim is the bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward, 2020, and you're watching this scene. Suddenly, Slim now is the future of sort of black power, however crude it is in this 1936 movie.
Yeah.
I mean, the other one I think of for 35 or 36, Judge Priest.
Uh-huh.
Did you ever see that?
Yeah, yeah.
It's just the personification of the plantation genre.
Yeah.
The fact that these two movies are, within a year apart,
Mm-hmm.
but you have that dynamic,
Yeah.
and so between, the dynamic between the two African-American actors and the dynamic between the two white women, it's just, again, watching it from today, the movie stayed the same, but you
Yeah.
watch it today and it's just, those are jarring.
Yeah.
Because you're not used to seeing that in 30s film.
Yeah. I think a lot of the audience in 1936 would perceive and understand it as you say. But I also think that in 1936, when the production code is fully in force, and movies have to be a lot careful about the content that they make, it's no longer the pre-code era. Hollywood, nonetheless, is very, very subtly crafting and shaping messages. And maybe it's not so subtle to our eyes right now.
Yeah.
When we watch this movie, it's heavy-handed, the kind of negative portrayal that the Chisholms represent in this
Yeah.
film as decadent,
Yeah. Very economically populist.
the film itself and some of the messages.
Yeah.
But at the time, I think that these subtle messages of liberation, of woman liberating herself, right, and how taking the geographical isolation of where this woman is from as a symbol of a whole bunch of social structures that essentially oppress and entrench her in places where she doesn't have autonomy, and the kind of subversive elements that existed between the two black characters in the film, the chauffeur, who is a good, obedient servant of the rich and privileged Chisholms, having a conversation with Slim, who is a more autonomous and free black man, part of a criminal enterprise.
Yeah.
There is a dynamic there that I think Warner Brothers and I think the actors and I think some section elements of the audience in 1936 were able to pick up on.
Yeah.
And I think these are the things that when we talk about liberal Hollywood in the classic era, this is core kind of liberal Hollywood stuff, if you will, or maybe more accurately, kind of progressive Hollywood. It had long been the case that observers, especially middle America traditionalists, would look upon Hollywood as bending too many rules and pushing the barriers too much, especially when it came to women liberation.
Yeah.
That was a key one, right? And the kind of socioeconomic critiques. Now, in terms of race, I think the Hollywood industry and the coming of sound really does solidify this. After 1927, Hollywood, the industry becomes super white. The black characters, if they're there at all, are completely fixed to the background, but become far less numerous than in the silent era. Mm-hmm. And the silent era had a lot more... there were lower barriers to entry, and there were more independent pictures. There was a race film industry that was economically pretty stable, but was almost entirely destroyed with the coming of sound, because the coming of sound brought all of these cost imperatives that raised the barriers to entry, made it harder for independents to get into the game. And Hollywood, in terms of race, becomes extremely white. Mm-hmm. Even tamping down ethnicities, right? There was a movie in the silent era called The Murphys and the Callahans that Irish Americans were outraged against and demanded censorship of. And portrayals of Jewish identity or Italian identity all become more tamped down and sort of cleaned up. And race and ethnicity becomes the great sort of unspoken, if you will, in the Hollywood movie industry for a long time. But in terms of economically populist critiques, though some of those things remain past the pre-code, and the pre-code was saturated in those things. So often the rich and privileged of a pre-code film would be portrayed as decadent, lazy, venal, villainous, self-serving, all of these different things. And the liberation of women was a long sort of thread in the development of Hollywood. And those things show up in The Petrified Forest in really wonderful ways, and a dynamic that I think perfect for Bette Davis, and a dynamic perfect for the set and the scene of being isolated in a diner. And now you've isolated these two different factions, a criminal faction and a rich and privileged faction. Mm-hmm. On the surface of things, Duke Mantee is still the bad guy and the villain, although we have a strange attraction to him. And on the surface of things, the Chisholms are still obviously good and innocent, and they're being victimized by this criminal psychopath. But that being said, just as we are somewhat drawn and attracted to Bogey's characterization of Duke Mantee, we're also really rather bored by the Chisholms, are we not? Mm-hmm. They have not a single good and compelling line. Their characters are completely forgettable. We could really care less about the Chisholms in terms of, being a spectator and being interested in this movie. But what happens below the surface of these things is we have this very interesting race dynamic going on, a dynamic that says something not just about Black American identity, but how Black American identity is connected to the socioeconomic structures of America, and the connections to criminality. Mm-hmm. And I think that this movie does some interesting work in somewhat, and these are some maybe subtle interpretations, but it does interesting work in somewhat insulating criminality from the rich and powerful and privileged. Yeah. And so this movie, this picture, as well as a number of other pictures in 35, 36, 37, 38, do the work of distinguishing economic elite and economic power from criminality itself, because that was such a concern in the pre-code era, And in the years following the Great Depression, there was a swell of a populist wave of people seeing economic elites as criminals,
Yeah.
as criminal behavior and endeavor. And the pre-code movies played on that to a great degree. But when the code comes in force, the code is this very conservative moment in Hollywood film history that tries to pull back, tamp down, re-articulate these things in ways that are quote-unquote politically and socially acceptable.
You conserve the status quo. I mean,
Exactly.
It's the definition of conservatism. You're conserving
Yeah.
existing power structures.
Yeah. But I do think with the characters of Slim and the chauffeur that while I agree with you that contemporaneously in 1936, a lot of people would have probably been like, would have received that the subtlety of that dialogue and that interaction as such, like, oh, the chauffeur is a good black man who's following the white order of things, and Slim is uppity, right?
Yeah.
But nonetheless, I think that there was no doubt folks in 1936 who were to see the subtlety and the subversiveness
Oh, definitely.
of that interaction.
Or imagine that playing in a black movie theater.
Yeah,
With a black
exactly.
audience.
Yeah.
Where it's, I mean, I always hear stories. Was it Melvin Van Peebles?
Mm-hmm. The great director of one of my all-time favorites, The Watermelon Man.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
Melvin
but
Peebles.
he talks about Casablanca, which eventually we'll get to. But they would, he said that in the theaters when he was a kid and he watched that in Chicago, the audience would force the projectionist to rewind all of the parts of.
Bojangles?
Is that who for Casablanca, the pianist?
Yeah.
Sam.
Sam is the name of the character. It's Dooley Wilson, Arthur Wilson.
Yeah, Arthur. Yeah, so they would. So it's I think there's it's one of those spectator studies.
Yeah.
Right. Everyone's
Yeah.
going to see the film differently according to the power relationships that are displayed on the screen and that translation to the power relationships that the audience has to swim through. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. So it's interesting film, The Petrified Forest, because there's so much going on.
Yeah.
And, but yeah.
And it takes place in one spot.
It takes place in one spot,
yeah.
and it's a fairly simple and straightforward story. But at the surface, it belies all the kind of complexity and social relations that go on underneath. And of course, this movie is obviously really important to Bogart's career. As I'm quoting here from a book called City of Nets by Otto Friedrich, Bogart's famous performance as the swaggering Duke Mantee seems today almost preposterous. His 2-day growth of stubble is supposed to make him look sinister, but succeeds largely in making him look disreputable. His voice is supposed to be a guttural snarl, but it fluctuates between an affected drawl and bombastic shouting. In short, Bogart looks and sounds like a nice young man trying very hard to appeal tough and terrifying. In its day, The Pretense was a great success. Richard Watts of the New York Herald Tribune was reasonably typical in declaring that Bogart provides a brilliant picture of a subnormal, bewildered, and sentimental killer. Perhaps American audiences of the mid-1930s, when more than 1/3 of the workforce could not find jobs of any sort, like to imagine that they were frightened by imitations of gangsters. So Humphrey Bogart, who had failed in his destined course toward Yale, became a gangster. Over the years, Louise Brooks recalled, Bogey practiced all kinds of lip gymnastics, accompanied by nasal tones, snarls, lisps, and slurs. He snarled and lisped through a whole string of superficial roles as the bad guy who dies at the end, San Quentin, Dead End, The Roaring Twenties. He got $650 a week, and toward the end of most movies, he got shot, snarling. American audiences were fascinated by the gangsters who had suddenly emerged from the dark slums into sunshine of political power during Prohibition. But nobody was quite sure how gangsters really talked, or even what they looked like. The gangsters themselves, ignorant ghetto boys like Louis Buckhalter, or poor farmhands like Clyde Barrow, didn't themselves know how they were supposed to behave. So Hollywood taught them. Just as George Raft, recollecting his boyhood as a dance hall gigolo, taught them how to dress, so Humphrey Bogart, and Jimmy Cagney, of course, taught them how to snarl. His voice was the elaborately casual voice of the tough guy in pictures, Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe remarked of a gunman in The Big Sleep. Pictures have made them all like that. I love that wonderful bit of history because it reminds us that Hollywood movies in the classic era were not just reflecting life. They were producing life. They were shaping identities. Hollywood taught us how to dress. Hollywood taught us how to walk, how to talk, how to carry a gun, how to talk to a dame, right? In the terms of these gangster pictures, right? Humphrey Bogart and Jimmy Cagney weren't, method actors who would go out on the streets with a pen and notepad and write down all the ways in which real gangsters behaved and then sought to mimic it on the screen. It was the other way around. Jimmy Cagney and Humphrey Bogart found their own sort of natural style intuitively and reproduced it for all of us to watch and witness, so that some of us could parrot those things, even if we weren't gangsters, right? Bogey taught you how to talk and how to walk and how to be tough, even if you're extremely hungover. And that, of course, was Humphrey Bogart. He was an unconscionable drinker, drank probably every night, far too later than he should have, got up early every day, was either still lingeringly drunk or hungover in many of his pictures. And I think that characterization definitely lends an element to the iconic sort of symbolism that Bogey becomes. Tough, tired, hungover, and damn it, willing to put in a good day's work, right? That's Sam Spade. That's so many of the detectives of these noir films that shape his iconic status in the 1940s. Before he met Lauren Bacall in the film To Have and Have Not, Humphrey Bogart was married to a woman named Mayo Method. And Mayo Method was a sometime Hollywood actor, but increasingly her roles dried up and her career sort of dwindled. Bogey and Method were a contentious pair, to say the least. They fought regularly. Had vicious, violent interactions. At one point, Mayo stabbed Humphrey Bogart in the stomach, which required hospitalization. Warner Brothers quieted all of this. Nobody knew this at the time. Well, at least no one knew about the stabbing, but it was it was a poorly kept secret in Hollywood that Bogey and Mayo were a very tempestuous couple. And when Bogey met Lauren Bacall, he was still married to Mayo Method. He quickly drops her, and her career and her life spirals down into terrible alcoholism and depression. She dies quite young and completely forgotten in a seedy hotel room in Portland, Oregon. But Bogart rises from the ashes and the ruins and ashes of his own giving, of his own making, right? In a sense. I mean, here was a man who struggled and really in some ways drank himself to death and consumed, was chain smoked, and, didn't take care of himself at all. He in some ways completely destroys his life, but there's this dialectical thing going on with Humphrey Bogart. Yeah.
He's the bright light, right? Yeah. What's that phrase? The bright light burns brightest, but will then fade.
Yeah, exactly. Let's talk about the Maltese Falcon a little bit. This is, one of the first, considered one of the very first noirs, and certainly one of Bogey's. This is a turn, a crucial turn. Movies that I mentioned before, San Quentin, Dead End, The Roaring Twenties. Bogey plays a character who's a gangster, who's tough, who knows how to handle a gun, knows how to walk, knows how to talk to the dames, right, and the parlance of the time, and has all of the things that he ends up being in these 1940s pictures, but there's something different. What's different about it?
Well, this is where he becomes the anti-hero. So those little glimmers. I mean, not all the movies he has this. I still would argue Petrified Forest, it's under it. Because he does the nice thing, right? He's going to help. He's going to kill Alan, and because he asked for it. Mm-hmm. But in Maltese Falcon, right? Some notes. He sees the world as corrupt.
Yeah.
It's a corrupt world.
Can I throw something in there about
Yeah.
Duke Mantee before
Yeah.
we move on to? Yeah, I love the end of this film, and there's that the moment, the culminating moment in which Leslie Howard sort of martyrs himself, right? But what happens before that, which I think is really fascinating, is that Duke Mantee's character is shown as lacking. His girlfriend Doris, I think,
She gets
fiancée,
captured, yeah.
right, and she effectively abandons him. And there's this moment, a close-up shot of Duke Mantee, where he's been abandoned by a woman, and it's this great sort of like violation of his masculinity or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's wonderfully portrayed, I think, by Bogey. So there's that complexity as well that in this film that carries on in these 1940s pictures, but does so in a different way,
Yeah.
through a kind of anti-hero lens, as you say.
Yeah. And so he's scared.
Yeah.
But I think with the anti-hero, he rises to the occasion. And instead of using this, using the fear using violence to cope with the fear, he understands the given is the world is corrupt. So he needs to deal with everyone he comes in contact with as corrupt. And I think what makes the anti-hero is you're only going to do the right thing if it doesn't destroy oneself.
Mm-hmm.
Because the world is corrupt. And I'm not going to stick my neck out too far because the world is corrupt and you are not going to put everything, you're not going to go out on a limb.
Yeah.
It's not worth it.
Yeah.
And I think the good thing the cool thing in the Maltese Falcon is he's always using leverage, right, to negotiate corruptness.
Yeah. There's a playing with this. I like what you said there, that you're not going to go so far as to destroy oneself or to harm oneself or disadvantage oneself. I think that is wonderfully articulated in Casablanca when Bogey says, "I stick my neck out for nobody."
Yes.
Right? But then there's always an element in Bogart's pictures in the 1940s and even the noir pictures where he reluctantly and begrudgingly does so.
Yes.
Right? So
The last moment, it's Han Solo coming back and helping blow up the Death Star.
Yeah.
Like, he was supposed to leave. Oh, he shows up. Like, he's not going to stick his neck out for anyone, but there's always that, it's the little man
Yeah.
in the back, and it's like,
Yeah,
you know what, you need to do the right thing.
Yeah. And there's this grudging reluctance to do the right thing at the end, even if it means disadvantaging yourself, that Bogart portrays wonderfully in Casablanca, but also in The Maltese Falcon and in The Big Sleep and in To Have and Have Not. He's got to stick his neck out in order to do something a little bit more than just serving the self. Now, I think this is really fascinating because I think it connects to Bogart's political dispositions at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Humphrey Bogart, the man, the actor, what becomes a powerful, well-paid actor in classic Hollywood by the 1940s. After World War II and the beginning of the first two-act trials in 1948, that sought to expose and uncover communistic leanings within the Hollywood colony. Bogey stands up as a strong liberal voice, right? Bogey was one of the first people, he and Laura McCall were one of the first people to come to the defense of some of these accused screenwriters and producers who were being attacked by government authorities as socialistic or communist. This predates the McCarthyist Red Scare era. We were talking about this earlier. These are two distinct historical moments, the late 1940s, in which a lot of liberals in Hollywood, Bogey included, but Bogey was right at the front. He was one of the leaders of this. A lot of liberal Hollywood comes out and defends. But it ultimately proves unsuccessful. And the government comes down with a very heavy hand, and these folks basically cower and become powerless. And this really sets the stage for the crazier, more exaggerated and outrageous McCarthyist Red Scare moment in the 50s, led by the drunken senator from Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy. So, but that earlier wave, it shows Bogey in a similar light to his characters in a way that he wants to do the right thing and reluctantly does so. Gruffly gets on a plane with Lauren Bacall and shows his kind of, his like sort of masculine toughness. This was at a time in which to be liberal, to be a New Deal liberal, in no way could.
It wasn't
impinge on
effeminized. It wasn't feminized yet.
No,
Yeah.
not at all. You could be tough and masculine and strong and be a good New Deal liberal.
Because the New Deal liberals defeated the Nazis.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I find there to be his political persuasions to interestingly fit in with some of these characters as well. One of the other things that I think as anti-hero Bogey does in The Maltese Falcon and in Casablanca, definitely, To Have and Have Not, definitely, The Big Sleep as well, is that he's looking out for the underdog. He doesn't like bullies.
Yeah.
Doesn't like bullies. Now, he'll bully people, like in The Big Sleep, he's a good character actor, but he's sort of like this kind of adolescent-looking kid with a gun. Bogey actually in The Big Sleep is constantly referring to him as the kid with the gun. Do you know how to even work that thing?
Yeah.
Right? And he takes it out of his hand and kind of punches him in the face. And he needs to bully people, but he's bullying people who are themselves either attempting to be bullies or they're bullying some underdog. And Bogey kind of looks out for the underdog in a lot of these pictures. He does it in this characteristically misanthropic way. It's almost like he hates people, but he's going to do the right thing anyway.
Yeah.
He hates everybody, but he doesn't like bullies, and he doesn't like underdogs getting picked on. And I think that's an important characteristic to the anti-hero character in American film.
Yeah. It's sort of a redefined version of what we'd call libertarianism today, right? It's a non-mean libertarianism. It's everyone should just let everyone else alone. Don't bother anyone. I don't like being bothered. I don't like people. But the moment you start bothering people against their wishes, I'm going to have to step in and sort of break the rules of libertarianism, right? Like just everyone should just get along and I'm not going to interfere.
Yeah.
But the humanity part comes in and it's like, that's not right.
Yeah.
Because you should be letting them alone and not bullying them.
There's also, I think, an element of like appropriating bullying characteristics and dispositions and demeanor and behavior for the anti-hero. Because Bogey looks like a bully in a lot of those scenes in The Maltese Falcon and The Big Sleep.
With the quick slaps.
Yep, exactly.
Against Joel Cairo, which one of my, besides Bogart, Peter Lorre, he's so good in every single movie that he shows up in.
Yeah. He plays Dugarte, who is on the run in Casablanca. He plays Joel Cairo, who is this sort of slimy, squirmy, like, is he on the inside of this criminal enterprise or on the outside? You don't know where he fits.
Yeah.
In both cases, Bogey treats him with a healthy dosing of contempt.
Yeah.
But one of the great character actors in Hollywood, Peter Lorre, so terrific. Of course, played the child murderer in Fritz Lang's M, which is a very early sound film in German cinema before he came over.
Movie.
Yeah, before he came over to America. And, I mean, it's a wonderful cast in The Maltese Falcon. Mary Astor is terrific as Margaret O'Shaughnessy. Sidney Greenstreet, how good is Sidney Greenstreet in The Maltese Falcon? I think John Huston tapped Sidney Greenstreet. I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe that's the first movie that he ever made, Sidney Greenstreet. And he was generally on the stage before that. But John Huston saw something in Sidney Greenstreet that would be perfect for that role. No, he had other motion pictures before, but let me see here. Nope, that's his very first one. I was wondering if They Died with Their Boots On was pre-1941. That one's The Maltese Falcon is Sidney Greenstreet's very first film.
Who's that? Who's he? In that?
He plays the Casper Gutman character, the guy who's basically the one who's orchestrating this whole criminal enterprise, right? The rotund and very loquacious, English accent. Let's sit down and talk about it a little bit, you know. And that character, he does a great job in that role. And of course, then Is Sidney Greenstreet in Casablanca as well? I thought that, yes, he is. He plays Signor Ferrari, that's right, in Casablanca. So he plays a similar character in both The Maltese Falcon and in Casablanca. He plays a character who's on the know, who has a lot of sort of a lot of hidden information other people lack, and is able to kind of pull the strings in the background, if you will.
He's trying to buy the bar.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So he plays these mischievous, sort of quasi-criminal, quasi-not-criminal characters.
Yeah.
Right? You don't know the extent to
He's
which...
a criminal with class.
a criminal with class, and you're not quite sure the extent to which he's really pulling all the strings of what's going on. At least that's what he plays in Signor Ferrari's Casablanca. And the Maltese Falcon, he's much more central to the criminal activity taking place. But yeah, what a great character actor. We should wrap it up here for this first podcast of the spring 2020. We've been dealing with Humphrey Bogart. We'll be back soon with subsequent podcasts. We've got some ideas of some different topics of discussion that we're going to take care of. And I think we've kind of wrapped up a little bit of The Lonely Man and A Lonely Place. We didn't get to talk about A Lonely Place, directed by Nicholas Ray, another great Humphrey Bogart movie from 1950, and one that we began the podcast with. But we'll seed that back into the conversations as we go. We won't leave The Lonely Man in A Lonely Place behind entirely, but we're going to stake out to some new chapters in the Movie Imaginarium podcast. So that's all we have for today. I'm Dr. J, and this is Dr. Dan. Thank you, Dr. Dan.
Yep.
And take care.